Silas Maynard never wanted to live in a water tower, but after 40 years of disassembling jukeboxes and repairing coin-operated machines no one made parts for anymore, it started to make a strange kind of sense. The town had changed, suburbia swallowing the woods and pastures he'd known as a boy, and everything new felt artificial, painted to look timeless but hollow underneath. So when the water tower went up for auction, a rust-streaked bone-colored relic no one else bid on, Silas bought it in cash. He converted it himself over 2 years, not because he fancied himself a romantic or a rebel or anything poetic like that, but because it felt solid, anchored, real. Concrete legs, steel skin, a view from the top. What he lacked in sentimentality, he compensated with an instinct for structure. Water flowed down, always down, but from the top, he could see where it all wanted to go. That mattered to him. That made him feel sane in a world that was increasingly pretending it wasn't falling apart. His parcel of land wasn't part of the local community council. He made sure of that when he filed the deeds and updated the land use classification. The lots below his hill were under neighborhood control. Small suburban homes with manicured lawns and identical trash bins lined up like obedient soldiers each Friday morning. Their governing body, some flavor of a community council, ran the roads, enforced shrub height restrictions, handed out violation slips for holiday decorations left up past January, and generally kept to itself. Silas stayed out of their meetings, ignored their paper flyers, and built his own access road, a winding, asphalted strip with drainage ditches carved on both sides, reinforced with compact gravel and monitored by a single surveillance pole at the bend. It wasn't flashy, but it held up better than anything they maintained below. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't difficult. He simply didn't want interference. And for 6 years, he got exactly that. No visitors unless scheduled. No packages without a call. No committee, welcome packets. Just the sound of mechanical clicks and piano rolls in his shop, wind through the pine trees above his roof, and a refrigerator that never failed because he knew how to fix it. Everything changed on the 3rd day of rain. It wasn't apocalyptic weather, no sirens, no alerts on his radio, just steady, persistent rain, sometimes light and whispering, sometimes heavy enough to make the tin roof vibrate like a snare drum. Silas didn't pay it much mind. His drainage worked. He'd tested it the hard way back when he first paved the slope, and he'd watched water behave for decades, watched it pool and seek, watched it carve trenches in places no blueprint accounted for. The problem, in his mind, was never the water. The problem was always people trying to stop it from going where it needed to go. So, when he drove back from the machine shop on that gray Thursday afternoon and found his access road blocked by a wall of sandbags, 7 rows high, 3 rows thick, arranged in a perfect semicircle directly in front of his lower gate, he didn't get angry. Not at first. He sat in the cab of his truck and stared at it, windshield wipers dragging back and forth like an exhausted metronome. The sandbags were municipal grade, tan-colored with black stitching and labels printed in weather-resistant ink. They weren't haphazard. They weren't casually dumped. Someone had spent time, deliberate, precise time, constructing that barrier. He stepped out into the rain. His boots sank slightly in the mud at the road's shoulder. The air smelled of wet concrete and runoff. He walked up to the barrier and saw that each bag was numbered with a sticker, Zone 3. That meant nothing to him, but the consistency chilled him more than the rain. Someone was cataloging this like a project. He called the number on one of the laminated signs zip-tied to a nearby stake. Temporary flood mitigation, it read. Council authorized. No name, no direct contact, just a printed number. He called. It rang twice. Then a voice, pleasant, detached, answered and told him this was part of a temporary runoff control initiative targeting high-risk slopes. Silas gave his name and address. The woman paused, typed something, and then responded, "Yes, that's Zone 3. Council operations team determined that elevation runoff from your property poses an excessive drain burden on downhill infrastructure. Temporary measures will remain in place through the weekend. He asked what exactly gave them the right to block his only access road without notice. She paused again. The community council is empowered to take emergency infrastructure action during flood conditions. He told her his land wasn't under council jurisdiction. She said he'd need to submit an appeal in writing. Then she hung up. Silas stood in the rain for another few minutes, not because he didn't know what to do, because he was calculating how much trouble they wanted to cause and what it would cost him to undo it without playing their game. He climbed back into his truck, turned it around slowly, and took the long way around through the fire trail behind his property, a narrow, rocky stretch he'd only ever used once, and not since a storm 5 years ago washed half of it into a ravine. It was risky, but he made it. By the time he reached his shop at the top of the tower, his hands were shaking not from rage but from the calm clarity of someone being pushed on purpose. It wasn't the bags, it was the method. They hadn't called. They hadn't left a notice. They hadn't even knocked on his gate. They had come, dug in, and moved on, assuming he'd be quiet, assuming he'd absorb the inconvenience and swallow the insult because that's what people did when a council said the magic words: safety, emergency, community. It was never about the rain. It was about sending a message. That night, Silas didn't sleep. He sat at his workbench polishing a 1934 Wurlitzer cabinet until the cloth bled black with years of embedded grease. The machine inside still worked. It always did. Like most machines, it didn't care what people thought. It obeyed gravity, torque, resistance. He admired that. As the storm thickened outside and the pine trees bent under the wind, Silas listened to the rain drumming on the steel shell of his home and thought about how to respond. Not with outrage, not with revenge, but with a correction, a return of pressure, calculated and exact, just enough to remind the council that downhill wasn't always the only direction something could flow. He wasn't going to call a reporter. He wasn't going to write an open letter. He was going to wait, and when the next mistake came, he'd be ready. He wasn't angry, but he was watching. The next morning began with an unnatural silence. Not the peaceful kind that follows a storm or settles before sunrise, but the weighted kind, like the air in a sealed box, thick and still, pressing in from all sides. Silas woke not because of noise, but because of its absence. No crows. No distant hum of tires on wet pavement. No dripping from the downspouts that usually echoed like clockwork against the side of the tower. He sat up slowly, listening. Something in the quiet felt deliberate. It wasn't until he opened his door and stepped out onto the metal landing that he realized why. The sandbags had multiplied. The wall at his gate had doubled in size. What yesterday had been a 7-bag-high semicircle was now a solid wall nearly shoulder height, wide enough to keep a fire truck out, let alone his pickup. The laminated sign from before had been replaced with a larger, bolder one. Glossy, sealed in plastic, affixed with steel stakes driven deep into the earth. The language was more aggressive now. Zone 3, Containment, High-Risk Discharge Corridor. Entry restricted by emergency authorization. Do not remove barriers. There was no council seal, no signatory, just raw authority without identity. Silas descended the hill carefully, boots slipping once in the wet soil near the embankment. The incline was worse than he remembered. Runoff from the higher crest had already started pooling at the base of the tower's foundation, a shallow sheet of water tracing paths toward the low trench he'd spent years shaping and reinforcing. But the sandbags had blocked the channel completely. Instead of following the contour he'd designed, the water had begun to back up, seeping through the soil beneath the first row of gabions he'd installed the previous spring. He knelt and touched the ground. It was soft. Too soft. Even with compacted layers beneath, the pressure was going to collapse the trench if it kept backing up like that. A sudden splash caught his attention. He stood up and looked toward the hill where the sandbag barrier curved toward the neighboring slope. There, about 30 feet away, a woman in a slick orange rain jacket, hood pulled high, was tossing another bag into position. She didn't see him at first. Her back was to him, and she moved slowly, methodically, as if laying bricks rather than sandbags. When she turned and caught sight of him, she didn't flinch or offer a greeting. Instead, she straightened her posture, pulled back her hood, and gave him a tight, unapologetic smile. She was broad-shouldered, heavy-set, her cheeks red with wind exposure. Her hair was a solid, dyed brown that looked resistant to both water and reason. Her name, he would soon learn, was Marcy, from the Safety Subcommittee. As she would explain when questioned, though she carried no ID, wore no insignia, and offered no paperwork to support the claim. She walked up the incline toward him without invitation, boots squelching in the wet soil, hands clasped in front of her like a school principal about to deliver a condescending lecture. "I assume you've seen the reinforcement," she said without preamble. Her voice was high-pitched, clipped at the ends like she was used to interrupting people and being interrupted in return. "We were notified about an overflow threat from this parcel. Given your elevation, you're part of our active discharge corridor now." Silas didn't reply immediately. He looked past her at the barrier, then at the pooled water inching dangerously close to the base of his foundation. He asked her, calmly and directly, why no one had spoken to him, requested permission, or coordinated any sort of access. She smiled again, this time wider, as if she was explaining to a child that rules didn't apply during emergencies. "Flood risk doesn't wait for invitations," she said, almost cheerfully. "And according to the Council's Community Readiness Plan, parcels bordering communal runoff routes fall under Joint Mitigation Authority. This is standard procedure. Your parcel happens to be at the end of the slope, which makes it ideal for flow regulation." He asked her who determined that, and on what grounds. She gestured vaguely toward the slope. "We've got mapping data, runoff models, pre-approved by our environmental consultant. The Council's mandate allows adaptive response during high saturation. This is adaptive. You're the lowest point between zones 2B and 3C. It's just basic hydrology." Silas didn't argue the science. He didn't question the jargon. But what bothered him more than the nonsense authority was the tone of her voice, the rehearsed confidence, the smug patience of someone who expected compliance not because they had earned it, but because they assumed it. He told her, again, that his land wasn't part of the Council's jurisdiction. She tilted her head slightly and replied that legal boundaries didn't nullify physical realities. "Water doesn't care who owns what," she said, gesturing toward the soggy hillside. "It goes where it wants. And right now, we want it to go there." She pointed toward the trench behind the new bags, right through the channel he had built, the same one now backing up. Then she turned and walked away, back to her task, lifting another bag from a stack someone had left at the edge of the road. Silas didn't follow. He stood in place and stared at the sign, the plastic glistening under a drizzle that was starting to harden into sleet. Later that afternoon, Silas tried contacting the Land Commission office. After 4 transfers, he reached someone who sounded too young to drink and barely interested enough to take down his name. The moment he mentioned that he wasn't part of the community council, the voice on the line grew distant and non-committal. When he pressed further, the rep put him on hold for several minutes only to return and say, "Well, you're adjacent to a managed sector, and during water event declarations, certain easements can be interpreted more broadly. You'd have to check with the council's planning committee to contest." Silas asked if they had filed any such event declarations officially. The line went quiet. Then the voice said, "I don't see one on record yet, but those are usually updated post-incident." It was a slow, suffocating realization. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight or an accidental overstep. This was a maneuver. Deliberate. Coordinated. And it wasn't just the bags or the rain or the blocked road. It was the language, the avoidance, the cheerful doublespeak that turned trespass into emergency action and property damage into risk prevention. They weren't waiting for a crisis to happen. They were manufacturing one. By evening, Silas began to notice something new. A trail, not a natural one, but a shallow, man-made groove cut along the back edge of the sandbag wall, running parallel to the slope. It had been freshly dug. The line was too clean for runoff, too narrow for natural erosion. It curved deliberately toward the far side of his parcel, ending near the border with the communal green space behind the lower houses. At the end of the trench, someone had staked another laminated marker. Auxiliary diversion path, Zone 3B. No pipes, no drainage grates. Just a raw gouge in the earth meant to redirect the water straight across his land. Silas stood at the end of that line and stared down at the marker. He didn't touch it. He didn't kick it over. He simply looked, memorized the grade, the direction, the distance. This wasn't flood control. This wasn't about runoff. This was an engineered diversion, routed through his soil to protect everything downstream, everything within their jurisdiction, their fences, their insurance limits. His property wasn't part of the plan. It was the buffer, the sponge, the place where they could shove the overflow and keep their hands clean. When he returned to his tower, he found 3 voicemail messages on his landline, all anonymous. One was a robocall about compliance with emergency directives. Another was a recording of someone reading an ordinance number. The last was just heavy breathing and the sound of rain. He stood in the middle of his shop, surrounded by polished metal and restored bakelite buttons, and felt the quiet again. Not fear. Not helplessness. The kind of quiet that comes when you know exactly what's coming next, and you've already started working on how to answer. He wasn't going to wait for the ground to give way or the trench to collapse. He wasn't going to stand at the bottom of someone else's slope and pretend he didn't know what they were doing. They'd chosen the wrong hill to flood. Silas spent the next day in motion, not in a frenzy, but in that slow, deliberate rhythm that came only when anger had cooled into precision. He started by walking the full perimeter of his land, recording every visible change to the drainage pattern, documenting the pooling along the southern trench, the soft collapse near the eastern berm, and the way water now trickled unnaturally toward the rear of the property. He didn't narrate or comment while filming. No dramatics, just footage, angles, scale. He uploaded the files to a private drive and made duplicates on an old external hard drive he kept in a fireproof box in the shop's lower storage room, because people who made permanent changes without permission were also the kind who could make things disappear when it suited them. The more he watched the altered runoff, the more it became obvious that the trench they dug at the edge of the barrier wasn't designed to ease pressure. It was intended to create it. It didn't simply carry overflow toward his slope. It accelerated it, funneled it, turned a slow descent into a deliberate spillway. They hadn't just redirected water, they had engineered a pathway for failure. And if it failed, the mudslide wouldn't damage council land. It would destroy his. When he tried to contact the county hydrology office to confirm whether any permits had been filed for the work being done on or adjacent to his land, he was met with a mix of confusion and avoidance. One rep asked for the parcel number and then placed him on hold indefinitely. Another transferred him to an automated system that demanded a 6-digit flood zone identifier that didn't exist for independent parcels. A third simply told him that drainage enhancement under emergency conditions didn't always require documentation. Silas thanked them and hung up. He didn't call back. He knew what this meant. They were playing bureaucratic keep-away, sending him in circles until he either gave up or violated some minor regulation out of frustration. He spent that afternoon trying to reach the property inspector who'd approved his initial construction permit years ago, but the man had since retired. The new inspector didn't return calls, and the clerk at the permitting office offered only that field staff are currently prioritizing community-managed zones due to saturation events. Silas laughed under his breath when he heard it. Saturation event. That's what they were calling it now. Not a storm, not runoff, an event. like it was a parade or a wedding. Euphemisms always appeared just before someone got screwed. By the time he reached his tower again, the rain had begun to lighten. The air smelled of overturned soil, a mix of wet roots and exposed sediment. At the base of the slope, the water had already carved new channels through the trench's weakened edge. Sediment swirled in slow circles where it used to drain smoothly toward the retention pit. He noted the damage, the spreading discoloration in the water, the angle of tilt in the retaining mesh. It was moving faster now, degrading more rapidly than any natural runoff ever could. He had 2 days, maybe less, before the channel failed completely. That evening, a pickup truck pulled into the lower road, unmarked, silver, clean, newer than anything Silas had ever owned. 2 men got out, both in reflective vests that bore no logo, no municipal seal, no clear identification. One held a clipboard, the other carried a compact metal case. They walked with the quiet confidence of people who were used to acting without being questioned. When Silas approached them, they introduced themselves not by name but as infrastructure review consultants, working on behalf of the safety committee. The man with the clipboard smiled with professional indifference as he began speaking about slope mapping and risk corridors and hydrological load zones. Silas interrupted him and asked plainly if they had jurisdiction. The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he pivoted to language that sounded rehearsed, legalistic, evasive. He explained that provisional observation rights were granted under a subclause of the Regional Emergency Management Charter. He said cooperative land alignment was encouraged during mitigation phases. When pressed, he clarified that no permit was required for temporary equipment placement adjacent to an active remediation zone. Silas asked what kind of equipment they were placing. The man smiled again, tighter this time, and replied that they were only there to assess. Silas looked at the case. It was a surveyor's unit, but it was old, too heavy for modern digital mapping, likely weighted, possibly modified, designed to do more than measure. He told them to leave. The man with the clipboard hesitated, then said they'd be back with authorization. Silas told him to bring it, and not to forget a badge. The man's smile disappeared. The 2 returned to the truck without further argument and drove off without looking back. After they left, Silas walked the length of the road where their tires had marked the gravel. He noticed a small indentation just beyond the bend, a stake in the ground, barely visible, topped with orange plastic and marked Temp. He pulled it out with one hand. The bottom was freshly sharpened. There was no label, no flag, no note, just a silent claim planted in his earth. He burned it. The next day, a letter arrived, folded in half, sealed with tape, no return address. Inside was a printed notice accusing him of unauthorized interference with emergency infrastructure. It cited no statute. There was no contact number, no name, just a warning that further interference would be referred to the local compliance board. Silas read it once, then fed it to the shop's shredder, where it joined the remains of the original laminated sign from the gate. That night, the wind picked up. The sky stayed a solid, suffocating gray. No stars, no moon. Just the quiet roar of the next storm building. Silas didn't sleep. Instead, he walked the perimeter again with a high-powered flashlight, checking for new markers, signs of tampering, fresh cuts in the soil. Near the base of the slope, he found a crushed plastic bag labeled Council Use Only, filled with broken stakes and half-empty sealant cartridges. Someone had been working in the dark. Not hours ago. Minutes. The realization landed slowly. They weren't just redirecting runoff anymore. They were preparing for a controlled failure, shaping the land to collapse just enough to validate what they'd already done. If the trench broke and his foundation shifted, they could declare his property hazardous, maybe even uninhabitable, not as punishment, just as procedure. And once that happened, once the paperwork declared his parcel unsafe, they could make recommendations. not demands, just recommendations that he vacate, sell, or submit to remediation guidelines. It wasn't water they were directing. It was leverage. The next morning, the path to the lower gate had been further reinforced with a new row of sandbags. This time, not aligned in a neat arc, but stacked in a hard angle blocking not just the road, but a third of his driveway. The bags were darker, soaked through. Some leaked not water, but thick, sediment-heavy slurry, cement mixed into the lower layer to weight it down. When Silas tried to lift one, the fabric tore slightly. Inside was not just sand, but broken gravel and old roadbed debris, fill from some demolition site. Dirty, contaminated, likely illegal to dump without a permit. Someone was using the storm to offload waste and doing it on his land. He called a private hauling service he'd used once before during his tower's renovation, just a two-man crew with a skid loader and a flatbed. When they arrived and began prepping to move the bags, one of the crewmen took a call, walked out of earshot, and returned 10 minutes later looking uncomfortable. He told Silas that someone had called them directly, said the job was part of a legal dispute, that the bags were protected infrastructure, and if they removed anything, the crew could be held liable. Silas asked who had called. The man didn't know. The number was blocked. He said he was sorry, loaded his equipment, and left. That evening, Silas received a second letter, this one placed directly under his door. It was laminated again, clean, printed with the same smug language and empty threats. But this time, it included a QR code. When scanned, it opened a website, not an official portal, not .gov or .org, but a thinly disguised landing page that listed community safety breaches with vague descriptors and grainy surveillance photos. One image showed his gate partially open, the path muddy. Another showed him standing beside the trench, flashlight in hand. A caption read, Zone 3 disturbance recorded. There was no login, no context, no proof. Just the illusion of wrongdoing and the hint that someone was watching. Silas closed the page and sat in his chair for a long time. This wasn't a committee anymore. This was a campaign. They weren't documenting reality. They were building it. And now, the only question was how much farther they planned to go, and how far he was willing to go to make sure they didn't. The next day began under a strange, pallid glow, as if the sky couldn't decide whether to continue the siege of rain or to surrender to a weak, filtered sun. Silas stood in the entry of his shop, arms crossed, watching the valley below. His trench was no longer a trench. It had warped into a broad, shallow basin choked with debris and mud. The water no longer moved swiftly. It languished, accumulating weight, curling with a sickly sheen that suggested oil or rust, maybe both. The damage wasn't catastrophic yet, but it was creeping, slow and quiet. The kind of damage that didn't announce itself with noise but with silence, with things shifting underfoot, with warping thresholds and hairline cracks that wouldn't be noticed, until the structure already leaned too far to correct. There were no new letters that morning, no messages on the landline, no trucks arriving uninvited. Instead, something worse happened. Nothing at all. The bags remained. The road stayed blocked. The sediment continued to back up, and the air, though cool, carried a sourness that always came with trapped runoff. Old leaves, animal waste, synthetic fertilizer. A slow poisoning. But then, near mid-afternoon, Silas heard movement. Tires on gravel. He walked to the far window that overlooked the emergency slope, where the fire trail zigzagged behind his property, rarely used. A black SUV had pulled up. Not the silver council truck, not the beat-up contractor flatbed. This was newer, high clearance, no plates, no markings. A woman got out, short, lean, dark clothes under a waterproof coat too nice to have come from any local depot. She didn't walk like the others. She moved like someone with an agenda, but no time to explain it to anyone she didn't respect. She didn't knock. She stood at the edge of the driveway, clearly visible in the camera feed Silas kept running on his screen inside. Her arms were at her sides. She didn't have a bag, didn't look up, didn't call out. After a full minute, Silas stepped outside. "You're not from the council," he said plainly. "No," she replied, "but I've worked with them." She didn't offer a name. He didn't ask. The way she looked at the trench told him she knew exactly what it was, and, more importantly, what it was becoming. She pointed toward the backing water, her face unreadable. "They're losing control of it," she said. "The slope's wrong. The way they shaped it. If the bottom fails, you won't lose just the edge. You'll lose the foundation. The tower will lean. Maybe not collapse, but you'll have to vacate." Silas narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you here?" "I don't like what they're doing," she answered. "Not just to you. Others too. You're the last one who hasn't caved or signed over, so they're forcing the outcome. Quietly, with hydrology and paperwork." He didn't believe her fully, but he didn't need to. What she said made sense, too much sense. He asked her what she expected him to do. She looked him in the eye. "Buy time. Move water. Reverse pressure." He studied her. That wasn't just advice. That was instruction. Tactical. Targeted. Someone had given her clearance to talk. Not to stop what was happening, but to warn someone worth warning. She left without another word. Her SUV drove off the way it came, disappearing behind the bend where his cameras couldn't follow. Silas walked back inside and sat at his desk for a long while, watching the water rise in real time. By the time the next cloud bank rolled in, his decision was made. He didn't draft letters. He didn't wait for dry weather. He acted. At the edge of his property, behind the tower where the grade was still firm, Silas unlocked the old machinery shed, the one that used to house his excavation tools during the initial conversion years ago. Inside, beneath a tarp, sat the diesel-powered compact loader he hadn't used in 3 seasons. The tires were low, the paint dulled, but the battery was sound. He fueled it manually, tightened the fittings, ran a cold start, and let it hum while he pulled out the attachment arm for sand and debris. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't new, but it could carry 3 dozen sandbags in one pass, and he didn't need more than that. At dusk, he descended to the front gate and began the operation. One by one, he pried up the sandbags from the base of the blockade. Not by hand, by machine. The loader's arm slid under each one, rocking it loose from the soaked soil. The gravel and cement mix inside added weight, but the loader handled it. As he lifted them, he placed each bag carefully, deliberately, not onto his own slope, not to the side, not into his trench. No. He carried them 50 meters down the fire trail and placed them in a tight, clean wall across the entrance to the council's lower lot. He worked quietly, headlights off. The loader had mounted floodlights. He used those, but angled them downward so they lit only the area of work. By the time he finished the first layer of new blockade, his blockade, he returned for another pass. This time, he added a second layer, not as a blockade, but as a redirect. He formed a channel in the gravel, angling the bags to push runoff toward the lowest point on council land, their drain hub, which he knew for a fact had been clogged for over a year. He'd seen it covered in dry leaves last summer. He'd heard the contractor complaining about it. No one had ever cleared it. If they wanted overflow, they would get it, right where they refused to maintain it. By nightfall, Silas had moved nearly all of the sandbags. The road to his home was clear. His own trench had been reinforced again with gravel and redirect tape, freshly installed. The artificial gouge they'd cut at the rear was filled with packed stone and regraded with runoff netting. The loader, covered in mud and diesel sweat, was parked in plain view next to the fire road gate. He didn't leave signs. He didn't leave warnings. He just went back inside and watched the weather shift again. An hour later, the storm returned. But now, the water had options. And for the first time in days, it didn't choose him. He fell asleep on his chair with his boots still on, listening not to the wind, not to the rain, but to the absence of rising water under his floor. It was a silence deeper than any rest, a silence earned, a silence he had built. The morning didn't begin with retaliation. It began with silence, the kind of silence that follows not defeat but insult, an absence of reaction so deliberate it felt rehearsed. Silas awoke early before the sun had committed itself to rising, and walked the perimeter of his property slowly, boots slicing through damp earth, steam rising from the grass in thin threads that shimmered as he passed. The night's storm had passed, leaving the slope slick but stable. His trench held. The redirected runoff flowed cleanly into the regraded channels and away from the tower. For the first time in days, nothing was backing up. The land had returned to what it was meant to do: absorb, divert, drain, undisturbed by foreign hands and idiotic geometry. The path he'd carved to the gate was clear, no new obstructions in sight, no plastic signs, no rogue bags. But as he reached the bend near the fire road, he stopped. The sandbags he had moved the night before were gone. Every last one. The loader was untouched. The ground bore no fresh tire tracks. Yet the blockade he had built across the council lot's entry had vanished, erased as if it had never been there. Not moved aside, not pushed or scattered, completely removed. The packed channel he'd carved toward the clogged drain had been filled in with broken tile, shards of concrete and brick, construction waste, dumped by hand. The surface was compacted, wet from the night's rain, but already hardening, sealing the flow from going where it needed to. Someone had spent the entire night undoing his work, and they hadn't just removed it. They'd rewritten it. At the center of the slope, where his drainage nets had been pinned into place, 2 wooden stakes now stood. Nailed crudely together, they formed an X, painted neon yellow. Attached with a staple gun was a laminated sheet with one word in thick font: obstruction. Below it, a code. Not a law, not a statute, just a code, likely invented for the occasion. Silas didn't touch it. Instead, he turned back to the tower, unlocked the basement utility room, and opened the large filing cabinet bolted into the foundation wall. Inside were the original elevation maps from his land surveyor, hand-sketched overlays of his slope before and after development, and the drainage blueprints he had submitted and received approval for when installing the reinforced trench. He laid them all out across the workshop table and took photos of each with timestamp overlays. Then he loaded them onto a drive, backed them up to 2 other locations, and sent them with a brief written statement to a contact at the district's Property Advisory Board. Not someone powerful, just someone bored enough to open an email titled, "Unauthorized Alteration of Permitted Drainage Infrastructure by Non-Jurisdictional Actors." He knew the message wouldn't change anything directly. That wasn't the point. The point was to make sure the evidence existed somewhere he didn't control. An hour later, as he prepared coffee in the upstairs kitchen, a low knock sounded at the front door. Not the gate, not the side shed, but the main steel door he never opened for strangers. Silas stood motionless, the mug still in his hand until the knock repeated. 3 soft raps, not rushed, not angry. He opened it slowly, careful to block the interior view. Marcy stood there, in a canvas raincoat spotted with flecks of dried mud, holding a paper folder clutched flat against her chest. Her face was dry, her hair pulled back with calculated sloppiness, and her expression was stripped of all pleasantries. Gone was the practiced smile, the feigned concern. In its place was a look of tense accommodation, the kind of face people wear when they've been instructed not to escalate, but fully intend to if given a reason. "I wanted to speak before things become litigious," she said without preamble. "You've taken steps that, frankly, jeopardize more than just your parcel. The board is prepared to file a motion for emergency arbitration if your obstruction continues." Silas raised an eyebrow. "You mean clearing my own drainage?" Marcy stiffened, adjusting her grip on the folder. We have documentation of aggressive action, including the redirection of infrastructure away from designated flow zones, the unauthorized use of construction equipment in a shared runoff path, and the willful placement of materials that blocked emergency access routes. It's all been logged. Silas said nothing. Marcy opened the folder and held it up. Not to give, just to show. Inside were photos. His loader, the Sandbags, the new channel. Grainy. Taken at night. Likely from a motion-activated wildlife camera or a low-grade drone. One showed him mid-action, bucket raised. "I'm here because we're still within the window for voluntary compliance," she said. "But if this continues, you're going to face more than advisory notices. The next step is assessment of hazard contribution. Once that's on record, you're facing a classification downgrade." Silas looked her dead in the eye. "You're threatening to devalue my property." She didn't flinch. "I'm informing you of administrative procedure." He didn't respond. She lowered the folder. "We can make this easier. The board is offering remediation services, cost shared. You let us implement a proper redirection system, and we'll file it as cooperative alignment, not enforcement." Silas smiled, not warmly. "Your proper redirection system tried to turn my land into a basin." "That's an interpretation," she said, voice tightening. "No, that's erosion. I've got the footage, the soil core samples, and the grade shift to prove it." Silas stepped forward slightly. Marcy didn't move, but she tensed. "This conversation's over," he said. "Next time, send a letter." She held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked away without another word. That night it didn't rain, but the air was too still. He went out twice, checked the cameras, verified the slope. No new stakes, no fresh cuts. And yet, sleep never came. Something was too quiet. At 4 a.m, the tower lights flickered, then went out. Silas moved fast. Backup generator online within seconds. His security grid rebooted. Cameras resumed. Nothing. Then motion alerts popped. 4 sensors along the north side near the rear slope. He switched to live feed. 3 silhouettes. Moving fast, coordinated. They weren't placing anything. They were digging. Not deep, just enough to loosen the surface, to destabilize the packed gravel netting he had installed to reinforce the emergency runoff redirect. One of them poured something. Wet, thick, steaming slightly under the floodlights. Likely quicklime mixed with fine grit, a soil breaker. They were sabotaging the slope. He grabbed his jacket, stepped outside, boots on mud, flashlight in one hand, voice calm and low. "You've got 10 seconds. They froze. One turned toward him. Young, early 20s, civilian clothes under a rain poncho. "This is private," he began, but Silas cut him off. "You're trespassing, tampering with certified drainage and caught on 6 live feeds." Another voice hissed behind the first. "He's got recording." They backed off, stumbling, one dropping a small red canister, definitely a dispersant of some kind, before vanishing down the hill. Silas didn't follow. He collected the canister, marked its position, and sprayed a quick soil preservative around the dig site. Anything disturbed would remain disturbed, chemically. He photographed everything, made backups, filed a new statement with the district, and this time included a video file titled "Unauthorized Night Entry with Suspected Structural Sabotage." No more letters arrived after that. Just silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was waiting. A pressure in the air like a held breath. Something was coming, and it wasn't another storm. The wind began to shift around noon, bending trees in one direction and then abruptly reversing course, scattering loose branches across the slope like warning signs. The sky dimmed in a way that was no longer just overcast. It felt like the cloud cover itself had thickened into something heavier, something with mass. The radar hadn't issued any formal alerts, but Silas didn't need a screen to recognize the smell of a pressure drop. The air hung too close to the ground, warm and metallic, and the silence in the woods around his tower was no longer passive. It had taken on the quality of anticipation, as if even the wildlife had sensed what was about to come. He walked the perimeter again, eyes tracing every inch of the slope, his boots kicking softly against the small divots left by the saboteurs 2 nights prior. The surface held for now, but he knew how quickly that could change if the soil got saturated enough. All it would take was one concentrated deluge. Not an hour of rain, not even 30 minutes. 5 minutes of real pressure in the wrong direction, and the geometry would give. From the base of the hill, the main road leading to the lower properties was already pooling in shallow dips, and the drainage system maintained by the council, if it had ever functioned properly, had not been touched. The same dead leaves, the same gravel sediment, the same untouched, half-buried grates stared back at him from beneath a thin sheet of dirty runoff. Across from the road, he could see the council's meeting hall, a squat beige structure set on a concrete slab just high enough to feel smug, but not high enough to survive unchecked flow. He noted the position of their lot, the gentle slope that funneled directly into their rear driveway, and then glanced back toward his own redirected trench, still intact, still angled carefully, but now strained. When the rain began, it came not as a gentle buildup, but as a solid wall, falling in tight sheets that immediately overwhelmed the ground. The first 15 minutes passed in silence. Silas remained at his upper window, watching the runoff snake down his trench like a living thing. Then, from his side camera feeds, he saw movement at the fire trail entrance. Another truck. Small. Green. City issue. It didn't approach the tower. It veered off, parked behind the lower fence line, and 2 figures emerged, hauling bags from the bed. Not sandbags, not barriers, trash bags. They dumped them directly into the drainage line. His drainage line, one after another, before hopping back into the truck and disappearing. Within minutes, the runoff at the base of his trench began to swell unnaturally. He didn't hesitate. He activated the loader, still parked by the side shed, and rolled it into gear, water already licking at the tires as he descended toward the lower edge. The runoff gurgled now, choking against the blockage they had created. The trench was failing, but not from erosion, from suffocation. With a roar of diesel, Silas drove the loader straight across the fire trail, then made a sharp cut down toward the entry point they had used. He knew the layout by now, knew how their lot sloped, knew what he needed to do. The first scoop came fast, his own gravel, mixed with the leftover cement chunks from the original reinforcement. He dumped it across the council driveway, watching as the slurry thickened and began forming a mound. Then another scoop, this time larger, deeper, digging into the trail itself. If they wanted control, they could have it. In volume, in force, in weight. Each pass dropped more material onto the council's access road, forming a barrier that didn't just block entry, but began to redirect the runoff that had tried to drown him. He wasn't careless. He wasn't vindictive. Every movement was calculated, each mound placed at the proper angle, forming a rough levee that pushed the water sideways, right toward the council's rear parking slab, which hadn't been elevated or reinforced. Within minutes, water began to pool at the base of their lot. Then it climbed. Slowly, but visibly. The rain didn't ease. It only intensified, hammering down in heavy chords, bouncing off the loader's cab, soaking his sleeves even through the gear. By the time he finished shaping the final ridge, the water at the base of the council lot was ankle deep. Their meeting hall lights were still on, though no one came out. He wondered if they were watching. He hoped they were. He parked the loader just off the trail, turned off the engine, and walked the long way back around the slope, checking for new flow patterns. His trench had cleared, barely. The water now moved again, not fast, but clean. The blockage from the trash bags had flushed downstream, likely now caught somewhere in the base of the council property. Fitting. As the rain slowed, the pressure in the air broke and the wind shifted again, cooler this time. From the ridge, Silas could see the damage. The council's rear lot was flooded. Their generator, positioned too low and never shielded, was half submerged. The lights in the building flickered and then cut. A second later, emergency lights kicked in. No sirens, no shouting, just quiet panic under fluorescent backup glow. And then the rain stopped. Not gradually, instantly, as if the clouds had been unplugged. The water continued to run for another hour, but it did so now on paths Silas had carved with purpose, not ones others had sabotaged. He stood beneath the overhang of his tower as steam rose from the road, watching the council lot slowly drown in its own neglect. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak. But he didn't retreat either. Not this time. The following morning brought no sound of rain, only the gentle hiss of water draining through gravel and the slow, irregular thumps of droplets falling from overburdened branches. The air had turned colder overnight, crisp and mineral-heavy, as if the ground itself had finally exhaled. Silas stood on the upper landing of the tower, boots planted against the metal grating, the sleeves of his jacket damp at the cuffs, and stared down at the slope that had, for the first time in nearly a week, returned to something like its original function. The runoff moved predictably now, curling past the reinforced trenches, pulling debris into the lower collector without backflow, and, perhaps most importantly, no longer attempting to root itself into his foundation. The emergency paths held. The new gravel ridge had remained intact. Nothing shifted in the night. There were no fresh sabotage trails, no new stakes, just quiet. From the tower's vantage point, the lower road was visible in full. The council lot still glistened with pooled water, but it was receding slowly, leaving streaks of silt and darkened pavement in its wake. The backup generator box near the rear utility enclosure was scorched. Partially submerged the previous night, it had likely shorted and failed under load. The lights had returned in the building's front office sometime before dawn, but no one had entered or exited in the hours since. A single maintenance vehicle, dark blue with a temporary placard taped to the inside of its windshield, now sat awkwardly in the side grass, angled as if the driver had parked hastily or under pressure. Silas watched but saw no movement. No voices carried up the hill. There were no footsteps, no shouting, no sign of confrontation. It was not a retreat. It was something quieter and far more decisive. They had stopped. He didn't believe it was a surrender. That wasn't how people like Marcy operated. People like her didn't walk away. They reassessed. They recalculated. They waited for a more opportune moment. Something less obvious, more bureaucratically defensible. But what Silas had done the previous day had shifted the calculus. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't touched their property directly. All he had done was return pressure, lawfully, methodically, and without fanfare. He had let gravity do what it always did, and reminded them, with absolute clarity, that interference could be matched with consequence. He didn't need a court ruling or a protest sign. He just needed water to go where it was supposed to. And now it had. Inside the tower, the shop was dry. The basement sump hadn't triggered once. The wall sensors along the southern foundation were clear of the moisture alerts. The power, stable. The surveillance system, unbroken. Silas spent the morning cleaning tools, inspecting the loader for wear, and brushing mud off the undercarriage. He refueled it, tightened bolts, and returned it to the shed. Locked, but accessible. There was no arrogance in it, only preparation. Not for revenge, just for continuity. Just in case. Later in the afternoon, he walked the trail alone, boots quiet on the packed dirt, a weatherproof folder under his arm. Inside were copies of the drainage approvals, time-stamped photos, records of the unauthorized interventions, and a printed version of the night footage showing the slope tampering. He wasn't planning to file a suit. Not now. Not yet. But the evidence existed. It lived in 3 different places, one in his safe, one in the county server queue, and one already handed off to the property ombudsman's office. Not out of paranoia, just out of prudence. Because people who insisted on control often didn't quit when they lost once. They rebranded the loss. They disguised it as consensus. And then they tried again, quieter. When he reached the boundary near the fire road, the old laminated signs had been removed. No replacement. The stakes had been pulled. The plastic markers along the slope were gone. Even the neon X's that had marked his reinforced runoff path had been stripped clean, the soil beneath them tamped down carefully to avoid drawing attention. It wasn't cleanup. It was denial. Pretend it never happened, and maybe no one will ask what did. Silas didn't touch the spot. He didn't linger. He simply turned back toward the tower, letting the silence follow him. That evening, while making repairs to a late 1940s Seeburg jukebox amplifier on his bench, he heard the soft crunch of tires on wet gravel. Not from the council road, from the trail. He muted the shop speaker, removed his gloves, and watched the camera feed. A single sedan. Old, civilian, no markings. A man in his 60s stepped out, holding nothing but a sealed envelope. He didn't come close. Just walked to the gate, placed the envelope between the slats, and left. No note. No words. The car drove off before Silas even made it to the bottom of the hill. Inside the envelope was a printed letter with no header, no signature, no contact number. Just a single sentence. No further action will be taken at this time. He folded the paper neatly, placed it in the same folder as the rest of the documentation, and slid it into the cabinet. Then he made coffee. No neighbor came to talk. No one from the council followed up. No one mentioned mitigation, jurisdiction, or voluntary alignment again. In the days that followed, the weather cleared, the slope dried, and the trench hardened. Grass began to return near the edge of the regraded fire path. Birds nested in the pines above the eastern wall, their calls returning slowly. The trash bags never reappeared. The unauthorized surveyors did not return. The backup camera feeds ran for another week uninterrupted, capturing nothing but rabbits and wind. Eventually, even the background tension, the feeling of someone watching, of waiting, faded into the rhythm of maintenance, repairs, and silence. Silas didn't resume life as if nothing had happened. He wasn't naive. He knew the pressure hadn't vanished. It had just recoiled. But for now, the land was his again. The road was clear. The slope was stable. And the tower stood tall. Not because it had been defended with outrage or lawsuits or cameras, because he had answered force with function, and function always won.